So I reopened ODP 304 because I was looking at the submissions and a lot of people had trouble getting 10 out of 10. So two things to keep in mind on that ODP, but more generally. If you are constructing a scanner inside your class's constructor, you've got to declare that object outside of the constructor, otherwise it's local. Right, so some people are having compile issues. And just because you're opening a scanner doesn't mean you need to do anything with it, right? So in your constructor, you're not going to do any input. The only time you do input is in the read method. And some people were opening the scanner in the constructor and then reading until they hit the end of the file, and then they're not getting the expected results. So if you didn't get 10 out of 10, it's open again until tomorrow morning. So give it a shot and let me know what you're running into. I'm leaving town at about 4 this afternoon, and I'll have limited availability tomorrow, but I'll be able to sneak in emails here and there. So, questions? How's PA2 coming?
I got a question about PA2.
Cool.
So, hold on, let me see. I think it was Wordlist class.
Mm-hmm.
So, I hope you understand this. So, the index utility reads the STDIN,
Mm-hmm.
and it separates out the word.
Mm-hmm.
It creates a new word list.
Mm-hmm.
Already, new word list, and then it adds the word into that word list. From that point, is it using that object to be adding future words in, or is it putting new words each time?
It reads in the entire stream at that point. So you only call this indexer once, and it indexes the entire input stream.
Because I'm trying to understand the add class function from the Wordlist class.
So when you run this thing, right, you're going to make an index utility. You're going to call the build index method. And when you call this method, build index, that reads everything from standard in. It builds up the linked list of linked lists. It keeps everything alphabetized. It does all of that until it hits the end of standard in. And then it returns, and what it returns is a word list. Right, and at that point your word list is the full index of all of that input. So inside this method, you want to start reading everything that you described. Read in the words, separate them, by spaces. Look in your list to see if you find them, update the references, and so on. Your constructor is not going to do a whole lot of anything except maybe some initialization. Right, it's really when you call build index that everything happens.
Wait, so in our space, the only thing that separates the words, we're looking for autocharacter like exclamation mark period.
How did I specify it?
You didn't really say anything about it, I don't think.
Break it into tokens. So my intent is that you use the next method in scanner. I don't seem to have it in here, but what we described was to use the scanner class to do your input and use has next and next, right? And that tokenizes, and it's things separated by spaces.
Okay.
right? So don't treat dashes, commas, semicolons, anything else any differently from any other character,
Okay.
right? And don't try to do the parsing yourself unless you really feel like you want the challenge of doing that. You can read in an entire line of text and then you can try to break it up by spaces and things like that. You don't have to do that. Okay, if you open a scanner on system.in, you can say scanner.next, that will give you the next token. Okay, every time you say, you know, whatever your scanner object is called, sc.next, you get a new token.
Oh.
Okay, and that saves you from doing any kind of parsing or anything like that. The only modification you're doing to those tokens is you're converting them to lowercase. Okay, and that's just calling to lowercase. So like I say, if you find yourself going down a rabbit hole and it feels like, well, I've been working on this one piece of code for 10 hours, right? Pop your head up and shoot a note or start a discussion.
Oh wait, so the word list in the example usage,
Mm-hmm.
that word list, my list, is basically the sentinel node, the first word.
It's could be. It's basically a handle. So my list is somehow getting you to this list where this, you know, has references. And if you choose to use a sentinel node, right, then this node always exists and its data is meaningless and it's just pointing to the first node. If you don't use a sentinel node, then this is either null or it's the actual first word in your word list, right? And it points to a reference list and it has a word and it has a pointer to a next node or null. But my list is all of this stuff, all right? It's a word list. So it contains something that gets you to your nodes in your word list, right? And it's up to you how you do that. We did a sample, we made a linked list of rectangles, I think, right? And we had something called root that represented the first node, or if there was nothing in the list, root was null, right? So somehow this object contains the information you need to access the elements of your word list, which in turn gives you access to each of your reference lists, or the position lists, I think I called them.
Okay.
So keep thinking objects, right? This is a whole class of things that, among other things, contains this list, right? But also contains the code for manipulating it and initializing and so on and so forth.
Could you explain the, it's called, the function, there we go, yeah, add word in word list class. I mean, I feel like I understand it, but I'm not too sure.
So add word, you have your word list. It's got, you know, cat and dog and elephant. Right, so it's got some words stored and it's got, you know, some reference lists. And you get the next token from standard in, and you find out that that's the word, I don't know, Okay, so you read the word door, and you got a counter that you're incrementing each time you read the next word, and your position says, you know, this is word 17 in my input. Okay, so what you need to do at this point is you need to go through your word list and you need to look for the word door. And if you find it, if we were inserting the word dog, for example, we'd say, okay, I've already got dog in my word list. You go down to the position list, that's a linked list of integers. Go to the end of that list, add the integer 17. That adds a reference to this word dog. If it's a word you haven't seen before, like door, you march through, you keep the pair of pointers to see where the node is that you want to insert after. You get here, you've gone too far. You create a new word node. You store your word there. You take the previous node, point to that. You take this node, you point to where the previous node was pointing. You create a new position list. You store your 17 in there, have it point to nothing. Take the position list pointer and point to that. Okay, a lot of work you have to do just to insert a word at a particular position. Okay, this add word method does all of that. So that in your code, what are you doing? Read a token, add it. Read a token, add it. Read a token, add it. Hit the end of the file, I'm done. Return the word list. It makes your main build index like 5 lines of code, right?
So basically the add word is doing all the jobbers, you can find where to add it in.
Yep.
Okay, so yeah, because the string word for the parameters that you did, what throwing me off.
Okay. Yeah, so add word takes the word you want to add, takes the position that you found it in the file, and then it updates the word list.
Okay, yeah, but it starts off at the first one, then goes traverses to the last one.
Yeah, so if you start off the first time that you call add word, right, you're going to see that your list is empty. You're going to create your first word list node, store your data, make a reference list, store that. Yeah. And you can break that into other sub-steps, right? So this idea of you know, creating this new position list node, right? Well, that's just the constructor for a position list, right? Or adding to the end of it, you can make add to end of position list as a method. And if you know you want to add to the end of this thing's position list, you just say this node dot position list dot add to end parentheses 17, right? So modularize. Right? Be thinking about all the different behaviors that you need and try to find a way to sort of package those in small pieces and use them to build up the bigger pieces. That's sort of the whole purpose of this exercise, right, is to push that object mindset.
Are you going to test this program on your own main program?
On a what?
Are you going to test our program on your main program?
Yeah, I mean, I'll probably use a main program like this, but I'll redirect standard in.
Because I wrote part of my code based on like your main program, so I didn't like write it based on like my own main program.
Okay. Well, you should be writing basically this index utility.
Yeah.
Right? That's sort of the main deliverable.
Yeah.
So it's really, right, it should work like this, right? And all of these things should work too. But
Well, it's like I did something where it's like if there's nothing in input at all, it just made a new object, but it had like a null string in a position of 0. So that way my list.print would work.
Okay.
If that did something in that print, that would check it.
Okay. That's cool.
Yeah. Because if that wasn't the case, that would just crash.
Yeah. Okay, that's fair. And yeah, I'll probably run it on War and Peace also. So that's a good test case.
Tried searching for that on the server. Couldn't really find it.
It should be under /temp.
Oh.
I think I left it there.
Every song that likes in Firebook.
Say what?
Every song that likes in Firebook. See that?
It might
I might have removed it.
Up until like
I hosed it. Bless you.
Thank you.
Okay. That looks good. All right, so I spent a while playing with Eclipse. And I think that fixed my problems. So if you're trying to use Eclipse from Linux, here's my suggestions. Number one, don't install it from the Software Center. Go to eclipse.org and download it from there. You have to do a bit of work. You end up with a whole hierarchy. You have to stick that in your path somehow. Okay, so it's not totally slam dunk, but you know how it works, Linux. This export seems to be the key to making Window Builder behave better. Right, so I think this forces it to use GTK version 2 instead of 3, and that's rock solid as far as I can tell so far. I played with it for a few hours and had no flakiness, and some things that weren't crashing before but were a little weird seem to be coming out fine. I have no idea if this is critical or not, but I put it in and it works, so I'm not taking it out. So that seems to work better. And I posted an announcement on Canvas with this and some other information, including how to get VI working in the Eclipse editor if you want to do that. It's a utility called VWrapper, and there's a site you can use as a repository and pull down the code from that. It's pretty painless to install. And a general comment that you need to generally save your preferences if you make changes. Save those in an export file, because sometimes when you switch workspaces, your preferences get reset, and that's unfortunate because it takes a lot to set them up sometimes. So, and I get very few crazy messages now. I get this stuff in the start, and then that's it. So I take that as a promising sign.
Instead of all critical errors.
Yeah. So we'll do more GUIs. We'll make a J-frame. Changed my text. Why not? And I found F12, so F12 switches between the source and the design tab. Progress bar works. That's good. All right. So let's go through some things. I'm going to stick with, well, let me show you a spring layout. We played with this yesterday and there was some flakiness, which is not unique to Linux. I've had issues with this before. So let's pop some buttons down. And the idea of the spring layout is these things are attached to each other or to edges, so that as the window changes size, right, they move around in some reasonable way. And theoretically, there's these little arrows on top, and if you click on one of these, if I want to anchor this to the right instead of the left, I should be able to click on this and say set right alignment. But it doesn't seem to work. It's actually never worked for me. But you can go into the code, and if you know which button that is, looks like it's this button, right? If we want to anchor it to the east, we can just force it to anchor to the north and the east. And now it's like showing me the correct signs here. So now it's going to do the right thing. That top button will move as the right moves. So the layout manager is fine, it's just the interface to tweaking it seems to be a little rough. And ultimately at some point, right, you're going to spend more and more of your time monkeying with the code. Just because, right, code's always going to be more powerful than what you can drag and drop. Right? There's not going to be something you can do with a drag and drop that you can't inherently do by just editing the code. So the more comfortable you get with this version of your interface, right, the more control you have. So, and if you mess something up, right, what'll happen when you come to the design window is you'll, either it will do nothing or you'll get a big, long, horrible stack dump saying, you know, some kind of exception occurred. And you can either hit the reparse button a bunch of times and sometimes it'll work, or go back in and figure out what you changed in your code. All right, so it's not like super, super precious. So let's get rid of buttons. And having said all that, I'm going to stick to an absolute layout anyway. So we looked at a text pane a little bit. No, 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 no. Did I want text field? I'm going to play with a text pane anyway. Alright, so I got text in there, but it's falls off the edge, and that's that. I can right click on here and I can say surround with, bless you, and I can say surround with a scroll pane. And now if I run this and I run off, I've got my favorite scroll bar available. Yeah, and completely painless once you've Googled for several hours to figure it out. Right, and what's it doing? It's just making a scroll pane and it's adding that to your content pane. And that's that. All right. And I don't remember how much of this we played with, but a question had come up about making a new frame. So let's give ourselves a button. Which is really weird. Because this worked like perfectly at home. Could be the network. I'm wondering if it's like trying to like get somewhere. I don't know. I'm gonna find out. So let's make a clone button. Alright, so inside here, so this is called mainframe. Let's make a new mainframe every time we hit that clone button. That won't work?
That can't possibly get it here.
No, not at all. So we'll set it to be visible. So there's our window. These do nothing. If we hit the clone, we got a new window. And we can clone from there. And we can clone from here. But most of our stuff is missing, right? Now it's actually still there. If you resize, it'll pop up. But that's a pain, right? So here's one way to deal with this. So on our JFrame itself, let's add an event handler. And let's go to component resized. And inside here, we're just going to say repaint. We're going to talk a lot about repaint next week. But if we do that, that'll fix our cloning problem.
And if you close one, it closes them all.
Right now it's set so that when you close, you should exit. But we can take care of that. And now we can make lots of clones, and if we close one, the others still survive. And when you close the last one, your code is still running because it has no reason to exit. There's nothing inherently about closing a frame that causes your code to stop. So if you were really doing this, other than just playing around, how could you set that up so that when you close the last window, it exits? Sure.
Windows open equals 0.
Every
Okay.
time you close a window or something.
Every time you open it, bump the counter. When you close a window, you decrement it. And when you close and your counter's back to 0, then you go ahead and exit. So there's all these conveniences for us, right? That'll do things like automatically close when we exit, but we don't have to rely on those. We always have the option to get much more nuanced, go much lower level, and do things our own way. All right, another thing I want to mention to you, if I say File Export, and I come down under Java, I have the option of exporting a jar file. So a jar it's a Java archive. Okay, it's like a tar file, but it's made for Java. It's really just a zip file with some other stuff. But we can say, let's make a jar file. And I'm going to export everything. And I'll just call it haha.jar. That's fine. I'm going to leave all of that. I'm going to leave that. I'm going to finish. I'm going to overwrite. Oh, that's not what I wanted to do, though. Let me do that once more. So export jar file. We'll leave that, export everything. Okay, but down here I've got to pick what my main class is going to be. So I'm going to browse, I'm going to make it mainframe. All right, and I've got a jar file. So there's my haha.jar. And if I say from the command line java-jar, that should run my code for me. And if it's got graphical elements, that's not a problem, right? So there's nothing about Eclipse that's making this work, right? Eclipse is what we use to access Window Builder to write this code, but it runs perfectly fine from the command line.
It's the same thing that Vicinity did.
Yeah. And I can close these out, and you can see that my program is still running. Right, so I can Control C as usual to kill it. Or if I've got Windows popped up, I can come to the command line and kill it from there. So you don't have to be inside Eclipse. Eclipse is convenient for writing this stuff sometimes, but you can run it just through the Java command. I turned off my network. Huh. That's what I get. So let's push this over to the server. So I can try to run this on the Linux server, but it's not going to work, right? And that's actually a good thing. Did we talk about this yesterday? Okay, good. So here's the Linux server. And here's my haha.jar, or whatever executable I have. Here's my laptop. I can do PuTTY, I can do SSH, or whatever. And over here, I'm running code that is trying to display a window and pick up mouse clicks and pick up key presses and things like that from and on my laptop, right? And number one, there's a security concern there. Because if I could write a program on here that can display things on your laptop, I could really quickly pop up a copy of your current laptop, but it would be my program running. And I could grab all your keystrokes, right? And then pass the commands on to your system and so on, right? But beyond the security, right, there's just not a mechanism in place to say, draw a picture, light a pixel, tell me when the mouse is clicked. Right over here we've got this event-driven code, which is saying when a mouse gets clicked, I want you to start executing this section of code. And we're clicking the mouse over here, right? Somehow that mouse click has to get conveyed to the Linux machine, which has to somehow tell my program that an event occurred, so that the JVM will go ahead and run the right code. So normally, if you just use PuTTY or SSH or something, you don't have that kind of access. But it's pretty easy to do. So you can do SSH-X with an uppercase X. And that creates an X window tunnel or pipeline. And it's a little slow because all this information is being sent across the web, right, from the Linux server, wherever that is. I still don't know where it's physically located, to my local machine here. Now I'm getting nervous, it's not going to work. So I'll keep talking. But it hasn't crashed. But eventually this should pop up. Our expected frame. Don't watch. It doesn't happen if you watch. So this is something called X11 or X Windows. And it's a very old windowing system. There we go. Alright, so there's my window, and we'll see how long it takes to just do that clone. Very slow. This was really fast at home. Yeah, there might be like levels of firewalls or something, I don't know.
Because you said there was a security concern. So probably
Well, yeah, anything that goes in or out now is a security concern, I guess. Yeah, so, well, play with this at home, because it's not really usable at this speed. But that's the idea anyway. There we go, yay. All right. And in general, there's utilities that you can run on this remote server or any remote server that will do this. They'll open up windows on your local system, right? If you have this X11 conduit, so there's Xterm or Xclock or Xeyes. Let's see how long those take to load. But those are all just programs running on this remote side that are sending information back to your local client to show you a clock or follow your mouse or open up a terminal window. And they're just, you know, plain old windows. All right, so this stuff you're doing to create these graphical interfaces, you can take this outside of this development environment, right? And theoretically, if you give that jar file to somebody else, as long as they have the Java runtime environment, it should bring up the same thing and act the same. Now, if you put in peculiar components, if you have a layout manager that's not part of the standard distribution, or if you have you know, like if you did the Pi4J import that we're doing in the labs, and you don't put that inside your jar file, right, somebody else might try to run it and get an error saying they don't have the right classes. But you can add those in and bundle them and get this sort of self-contained thing. If you put that jar file on a Windows machine and you just click it, it'll go ahead and run it, right, if the defaults are set up correctly. So portability, right, is part of the storyline here, including portability where you have things that are doing graphics. And that's the part of Java that really kind of sold me on Java eons ago, was because doing graphics, I mean, beyond like Zenity or something like that, seemed like you were kind of bound to one particular installation. And Java's pretty portable that way. So any questions so far? So let's look at some other objects. Just get rid of this. Let's look at radio buttons.
Never heard them called radio buttons.
No?
What else would you call them?
You reconnected to the server. So
I did reconnect to the server. I'm not ready to blame that. It's the path to like madness, right? So why are they called radio buttons? You can only press one. What does that have to do with radios?
You push one button down and then the other button sort of presses pop back up.
Yeah, so where does this happen? Where do you see those kinds of radios? Have you seen those kinds of radios?
Or perhaps if it's it's like presets, and you switch to the fourth preset station
Yeah.
thing, the other thing pops up.
I
Yep.
haven't seen a radio station or anything like that, but I have like a little input box for my TV that does the same thing.
Okay. Yeah, so old car radios were built like this, right? They had presets because you don't want to mess with the dial when you're driving, even back, when it was like 30 miles an hour. But they were mechanical in nature, right? So it was this weird system of linkages and sliders and pulleys and springs and stuff, and you could pull a button out to lock in a channel, a station, and then push it back in, and you could set all of your presets like that. And then when you push in one of these buttons, that's the channel, and the dial would move to that position. And then if you push a different button, that first button pops back out, and the dial moves to whatever that preset was. It's a really miraculous system. And that's basically how radio buttons work. So whichever one you select, the others will be unselected. But by default, they don't actually do that.
Some radio buttons.
Some radio buttons.
Yeah, so you have to like link them together?
You have to link them together, exactly. So if you right click, you can say set button group, and there's no button groups yet, so I'll just make a button group. And on the second one, I can say set button group, and I can put it in that button group I just created, and this will link them. And now we've got the behavior we expect. And I'm going to put back my exit code so I don't have to keep doing this. And if we want to set a default, right, let's say we want to default to channel 1, we can come over here and we can change the selected flag from false to true, so that when it starts we don't have all of our buttons unselected.
If you select another one to be true while you're in the editor, does it automatically switch it?
Seems to
It's just
ignore
a
it. Yeah, well, that's good. They're really radio buttons. All right, so let's tie some action into these. So I'm going to right click. I'm going to add an event handler. I'm going to say action performed. I'm going to come down here, and I get into a method that passes me an arg0. And I'm going to do something different here. I'm just going to pass my arg0 to a method called doStuff. And this is so I don't have to write a lot of code again and again. So here's my action performed, and I'll do stuff there. And I'll do an action performed on my third button, and I'll do stuff there. And then I have to define what do stuff is. I forgot what kind of argument. It takes an action event. So let's just print out E.
It didn't automatically do this braces for you.
Yeah, I turned all that stuff off. So if I click this one, I get an action performed, and it says command equals second one. If I do this, it says command equals number 3. If I do this, it says channel 1. But we're getting all sorts of information in here.
Those wings are kind of confusing.
I think those are timestamps.
They don't seem to be able to.
Yeah, I think they are. It's probably like milliseconds or microseconds or something.
If you know, it's a question.
Yeah.
So this is off topic, but so if I have an if, else if, and an else, the first if compares, let's say, a number.
Mm-hmm.
The else if compare a 17 to a no.
Mhm.
I was wondering if the else be an else for the else if, or would it be the else for the first if?
do you have brackets everywhere?
Yes, yes.
Put curly brackets everywhere, and it'll be unambiguous.
But no, like I'm saying, like, so let's say first if 1 is greater than 3, then the else step will be if the word is not null.
So you're doing this?
Yeah. Like
Curly
this,
bracket?
Brackets, correct.
Okay. Close
Yeah.
curly bracket.
Then else if word is not equal to null. Brackets, correct. Then else.
Else?
Yes. So my question is, does that else?
So if
correlate
that's
to
not
the-
true and that's not true, it'll do this else.
Yeah, but would it correlate to the checking if word is equal to null, or is checking if 1 is less than 3?
So if 1's bigger than 3, it does this stuff and nothing else. If
Okay.
this is false, it'll see if word's not null, and if that's true, it'll do this stuff and nothing else.
Okay.
Otherwise, it'll do this stuff.
But it doesn't really correlate to any of the other steps, right?
No, it's a composite.
Mm.
If this, else if this, else if this,
Okay,
else
so then I
if
would
this,
need
else that.
to say if I needed to relate to the else if, I would need to add an extra if in it.
Yeah, you could do that.
Okay.
And you can always write test code to explore it. So I can hold down my control key when I click on these and I get modifiers and so on and so forth, right? So this action event E has a lot of information in it, right? We can get all those things that we're seeing, the modifiers, the time, and so on and so forth.
And when you say action event E, you're just declaring a action event named E, right?
I'm declaring a parameter to a method, right? And I'm saying E is an argument and its type is an action event.
Okay.
And up here, when I call do stuff, I'm passing arg0, which was passed to this method, right? So this was code created for us that said when an action is performed, go ahead and call this method and pass it an action event that describes what the action was. So I'm just passing that verbatim to this do stuff method, right? And what I do with that is totally up to us. But it can be any of these things. And if we do get source, then it's telling us the actual object that was associated with that action, in this case, a radio button. And a radio button has a getText method. But a getSource returns an object, right? It's a very generic routine, so if we cast it to a JRadio button, then the compiler's happy with calling the getText method. And so now if I run this, I can just get the text of whichever button I selected. Okay, so it's just an example, right? Everything that's floating around here is an object, and these objects have all these mechanisms inside these methods, and in some cases fields. And you look at the documentation and you just figure out what you have access to, what you're looking for, and you write code to bridge that gap. Right? So there's nothing particularly useful about this sample, right? It's just the process of working with these things. Yeah.
If we were to have an exam on this type of stuff, how much of this would we need to memorize?
It's really hard to give an
Memorize the
exam
whole
on this.
documentation?
I'm not going to ask you to memorize stuff, okay? But I would hope that you would know by the end of this, like, what a J-frame is, right? Because we're using J-frames, we're talking about J-frames. But do I look for an action performed or a selection changed or something like that, right? I'm not going to expect you to memorize details. Upper level concepts, though, right? but it's a bunch of classes, right? So what I want to talk about next week, starting Monday, is doing actual graphics output. So actually painting things on your display. And that's going to involve getting into class extensions and doing some overrides, and learning some particular things like the repaint method. And so there'll be some details there that you'll want to be familiar with. But it's something we're going to talk about for about a week, so it'll be pretty clear. But does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
So we are going to use this for PA2, right?
And you're going to use this for PA3, yeah. So you'll get experience with it. All right, cool. So I will see you next week.
So we're gonna do stuff like